Hello everyone, and welcome to our podcast series in the classical political economy tradition by the Vinson Center for the Public Understanding of Economics and Entrepreneurship at the University of Buckingham. The Vinson Center runs a series of programs in economics and related fields designed to promote a wider understanding of classical liberal economics and how markets, trade and entrepreneurship promote welfare in a free society. I am Juan Castaneda, Director of the Vinson Center, and today we'll be hosting Bruce Caldwell. Bruce is a research professor of economics and the director of the Center for the History of Political Economy at Duke University. For the past 3 decades, his research has principally focused on the writings of the Nobel Prize-winning economist and social theorist Friedrich A. Hayek. Caldwell is the author of Hayek's Challenge, an intellectual biography of F.A. Hayek in 2004, the general editor of the collected works of F.A. Hayek, a multi-volume collection of Hayek's works, and with Hansjoerg Klausinger, Hayek Alive 1899-1950 in 2022, the first volume of a 2-volume biography of Hayek. Bruce, I'm delighted to have you with us. You must have been fascinated to take on the project of writing a biography of Hayek, your first volume from 1899 to 1950. Indeed, one of the most influential thinkers of the 20th century. How would you summarize the political and economic atmosphere in the early years in Vienna that shaped Hayek's view of the world?
Right. So it was in the post-war period, post-World War I period. It was awful, in a phrase, both politically and economically. The war was quite devastating. There was, of course, the Spanish flu influenza that followed it. It was a very cold winter following the war, and there was real hunger. There was indeed starvation would be not too strong of a word in terms of what everyday people were facing. Hayek himself and his 2 brothers were sent away from Vienna directly after the war for a period just to recover. Politically, the Austro-Hungarian Empire had been broken up. So the various countries that emerged that were separate from Austria. Austria was a bit of a rump. You know, the armistice was in 1918. The peace treaty was not made official until September of 1919. So there was a period there where at least many Austrians, we've lost all of the empire here, but perhaps we could have Anschluss. We could join with Germany, but that was forbidden by the various peace treaties. So it was a bit of a rump of a country that was left at the end of World War I, and this was a period from the 1880s, 1890s onwards, was a period of the extension of the franchise, and what had emerged were various mass parties. And none of them were particularly savory in terms of Hayek's own political views. Even early on, he had tendencies towards liberalism. It wouldn't have been the sort of classical liberalism that we identify with him today. It would be more of a reform liberalism. He actually equated his early views in this period to be almost Fabian socialist. But the 3 mass parties, one was the Christian Socials, one was the Socialist Party, and the third, much smaller one, was a variety of German emphasizing parties. Well, the Christian Socials as well as the German parties were sometimes quite explicitly anti-Semitic, having things like Aryan paragraphs. The socialists were less anti-Semitic, but they certainly had tropes of Jewish moneylenders being associated with capitalism. So none of these parties were particularly attractive. And Hayek, in his early university days, so this is the end of 1918, early 1919, before the peace treaty had been declared and established. He was affiliated with a party that is a bit of a reform liberal party. It was secular as opposed to Catholic. It was promoted German culture, but was not anti-Semitic. The person that he was working with was Herbert Firth, who was Jewish by descent. And it was for universal suffrage as opposed to the monarchy, universal male-female suffrage. So it was progressive-ish, liberal-ish, but not full socialist, because the Austro-Marxists would have been the party there. So, I mean, I think you asked how this period may have influenced him. I think particularly after the hyperinflation took place. I mean, this was a little bit later, but certainly his concern for monetary issues was given by that. And he lived in Red Vienna, which was controlled by the socialists, whereas the country as a whole, the conservative parties had more of a holding in the outside of Vienna. Within Vienna, it was Red Vienna, so he got to see socialist policies. He got to see the various sorts of policies that one might also with the far right, and he found his own way. That was a way that was quite different from what was on offer for most of the people in the mass parties.
Quite often, Hayek has been labeled by his critics as a supporter of conservative policies. But you make it clear in your biography that this is far from being true.
Yes, I mean, I think actually the source to go to really get a sense of Hayek's views is the epilogue to the Constitution of Liberty. And there he makes it very clear that the left-right distinction he thought was not very useful, that it's far better to think of a triangle with socialist, liberal, and conservative as being the 3 points on the triangle. And he said, very often you will have socialist critics and conservative critics echoing similar sorts of complaints about liberalism. And certainly in the course of his lifetime, he experienced that. We see something similar today, indeed. There are elements, at least in the United States, of what so-called national conservatives who are embracing all sorts of protectionist devices that would normally be associated with the left as opposed to with the right. So I think he was very much of a liberal, and was fairly early on, and only became more so. Of course, von Mises was a big influence in terms of bringing him into a more classically liberal sort of position in the early 1920s, and he gradually came to adopt that position much more strongly as time went on.
When you say liberal, it's just to avoid confusion because of the different terminology we use in Europe and the US. You mean a classical liberal? I
mean classical liberal in the European sense as opposed to the American usage of liberal.
But perhaps you can comment a bit more on the criteria to define what a classical liberal is as compared to a libertarian.
Sure. So libertarianism, at least in the United States, is often associated with, in terms of economics, with someone like Murray Rothbard and others who were quite extreme in terms of their anti-statism. Hayek, as a classical liberal, saw a role for the state, and he often he didn't like the word libertarian, and he wanted to figure out how to refer to himself. And in the Constitution of Liberty, in that epilogue I referred to, he called himself an old Whig. And I think he has in mind a tradition that one could think of as emerging out of the kind of proto-liberals like Adam Smith in economics and John Locke in politics. That these are people who are concerned about the individual and the idea is that the state has to exist. You give all the coercive powers to the state, and then you put limits on the state. So it's not a denial of the importance of the state. The state's absolutely essential to protect property rights, to protect people's lives, to enforce contracts, to have a police system, things like national defense. All of these things are things that are necessary for a well-functioning society that Hayek thought was quite compatible with liberalism. And then the people that he interacted with would have been from across the spectrum in terms of what further functions of the state might be viewed as important. And he was quite prepared to have all of those conversations. One reason that he participated in the Colloque Lippmann in the late 1930s, and also founded the Mont Pelerin Society, which had its first meeting in 1947, was to get a discussion going with people who may have agreed on the broad outlines, but then differed on some of the details of what would be a proper liberal state.
A major episode in Hayek's life was his move to London in the early 1930s, and his intellectual discussion with John Maynard Keynes on the causes of the Great Depression and the remedies for it, if you like. What was Hayek's attitude towards Keynes during this exchange and intellectual discussion?
Yes. Well, I know that today they're viewed as these great rivals, and I think that there was elements of that truth in that. Certainly, their initial exchanges that took place right as Hayek was arriving from Vienna to take a position at the London School of Economics, he reviewed not the general theory, but a treatise on money, Keynes's 1930 book, and Hayek was critical of it, and Keynes had a strong reaction against the criticism. So, in responding to the first half of Hayek's review of a treatise on money, Keynes replied to some of Hayek's criticisms, but then went on the offensive and attacked Hayek's own book, Prices in Production. And Keynes was a wonderful stylist. I have a quote from his response to Hayek, where he said that Hayek's book was an example of how, starting with a mistake, a remorseless logician can end up in Bedlam. Bedlam being the mental hospital. So I mean, it was quite a feisty exchange, and they had met earlier in the late 1920s, but this was the one that really got everyone's attention. As time went on, however, they both started working on their own projects. Keynes obviously wrote the General Theory, which became probably the most well-known economics book of the 20th century, whereas Hayek wrote The Pure Theory of Capital, equally unknown, a book that was published in 1941. So they went their separate ways, trying to develop further their models. I think both of them recognized the truth in the criticisms that each of them had given in the early 1930s. Hayek certainly recognized that he needed to make some revisions in Prices in Production, and Keynes equally, not just because of Hayek's response, but the response of others in the Cambridge Circus, etc. So it's a nice episode. I will simply say that later in the 1930s, as the world became much more much crazier, and you started to have fascisms emerging everywhere, and real emphasis on socialism in England in the 1930s, great popularity, great enthusiasm for socialism, that both of them saw themselves as liberals who were in that sense kind of on the same side. Hayek was quite enthusiastic, for example, about Keynes's pamphlet "How to Pay for the War," as it was clear that England was heading towards war. So they became quite good friends, saw each other much more during World War II, because Keynes would travel to Cambridge on the weekends, and the LSE had evacuated there, so they'd be seeing each other socially then.
Given that they had such a fascinating exchange in the early 1930s, and given the popularity of the general theory in 1936 and afterwards, of course, what explains, do you think, Hayek's silence, no response to the general theory afterwards?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. Hayek actually gave a number of different answers, and so it may have been a number of things, or it is a good question. So some of the things that he said was, first of all, Keynes had changed his mind about a treatise on money, so he thought that perhaps Keynes would change his mind again about the general theory. I think he recognized that their disputation in the early 30s didn't lead to didn't lead anywhere really. So he thought maybe it's better not, instead of having disputation, just simply I'll do my own work. He did seem to recognize that Keynes's macroeconomic approach was something that was really different and didn't really know what to make of it. And if you've looked at the general theory, it's not a particularly transparent book. It's not an easy book to read. So I think he probably also thought, well, geez, do I really want to spend my time doing this? Maybe I would be better to spend my time working on the pure theory of capital. And then, as I said, as the 30s progressed, I think they more or less saw each other on the same side. So those are some of the reasons. There had also been a very strong negative review by one of another Cambridge economist, the Prof. A.C. Pigou, and I think there may have been some feeling that, well, we don't want to pile on, because it was a pretty devastating, very negative review, and to come from a fellow Cambridge Don is that was viewed as something that was probably going to be a very significant review. And they just didn't know it was going to be the general theory. Let me tell you.
Right. Well, Hayek, of course, was very prominent in academia in the defense of classical liberal principles, but also very influential beyond purely academic circles, if you like. What explains the foundation by Hayek of the Mont Pelerin Society?
Sure. So the Mont Pelerin Society is an organization of classical liberals that Hayek founded by having calling a meeting where he invited people from lots of different countries to Mont Pelerin, a place on Lake Geneva in Switzerland. They met for 10 days in April 1947, and at the conclusion of the meeting decided that indeed they would found a society. So this is 1947, 2 years after World War II has ended. Europe is still in a horrible, horrible place, horrible mess. Central Europe has still got the four different powers occupying different zones: the Russians, Soviet Union, France, England, and the United States. Price controls and all sorts of controls are still in place in most of those places. In countries outside of that region, you had the Communist Party being very active in both France and Italy. You had civil war in Greece. England was under rationing and would be until sometime in the middle 1950s. There were strikes in the United States post-war period. So there was a lot of political and economic turmoil, and virtually everywhere people were turning towards the left. The Labour Party had won in a landslide in England and was executing various sorts of nationalization programs. So it was a period when liberal ideas were really at their nadir, really at their lowest possible point. And Hayek, one of the things that John Maynard Keynes said about The Road to Serfdom, Hayek's book, was that he was in agreement, morally, profound agreement with it, both morally and philosophically. But he wanted to know exactly what Hayek's alternative to this socialist state would be. And I think Hayek took that seriously and wanted to have a discussion among the few like-minded people who still persisted in these various countries about what a liberal agenda for the 20th century, the post-war period, would be. And so that was his motivation, I think. The topics that were discussed were all of current interest at the time. And I will just mention that one of the books that came out of the Hayek biography that I worked on was that I edited for the Hoover Institution Press the transcripts from that 1947 meeting. For a number of reasons, I thought it would be important. The 75th anniversary was 2022, so that was one part of it. But the resonance of these questions that were being discussed at the time currently is really quite amazing. I mean, they were worried. One of the sessions was, what do we do about Russia? They're sitting there. Their foreign ministers are having meetings, and they're not no one's moving, and the Russians were quite happy to sit right on the border and wait for the West to get exhausted and tired and just pull out, and then who knows what would have happened. So, I mean, you have just similarities in terms of many of the issues that were discussed then with issues today that I think it's really quite remarkable. So yes, it was an important meeting. It was just soon thereafter that the Marshall Plan was announced. So it was really at the very bottom point of the way things were looking for Europe, and it was not until a couple of years later that things really started to take off again.
You have already mentioned The Road to Serfdom, published in 1944. I understand that this was a critical moment in Hayek's intellectual legacy, and it very much changed how he was perceived by the public. Can you comment a bit on it, please?
Sure. So this was Hayek's attempt to do something that was much more popular, and in part this was because the left had really captured the public discourse, and he was living in England, and particularly in England, he wrote the book with the English public in mind, and it was an attempt to criticize socialist planning, because a lot of people were saying, "Look, we're undertaking socialist planning now to fight the war." And if we have a single goal of winning the war, it can be quite an effective way to kind of get resources directed in the proper channels as necessary. And many people said, why don't we just continue on with socialist planning after the war? So this was what he was responding to in deciding to write the book. And it was a much more popular sort of work compared to anything else he had ever done. He was very much of a theoretical economist, engaging with other economists like Keynes in terms of monetary theory and theory of the cycle, with academic socialists that were colleagues of his at the London School of Economics about the critique of socialism. But this was a much more popular work, and it turned out, it came out in 1944, but there was a Reader's Digest condensation of it in the United States in 1945 that really made it a much more popular work. I think people would not have noticed it had it not been for that Reader's Digest condensation. People would have noticed it, but it would not have gotten the attention that it did through this American magazine condensation, a 20-page summary of his arguments of an 180-page book. And that's the way most people learned about Hayek and the ideas in The Road to Serfdom. As a result, of course, with a popularization like that, some people would say, "Oh, geez, this is supposed to be an academic guy, and he's publishing this very popular stuff." For other people, it was quite an important moment. The person who founded the IEA was someone who visited Hayek in his office soon after the book came out and said, "Should I go into politics? Your book has really moved me." And Hayek said to Anthony Fisher, "No, what you should do is, the ideas are important." And apparently he took it to heart. And in the 50s, you got the IEA.
Ideas are much more long-lasting than politics. I believe that was his advice, wasn't it?
Yes. And Hayek apparently doesn't remember the encounter because, of course, this is just someone who's stopping by in his office, but obviously it had a great impact that way. So the book has a very mixed legacy. Another thing that came out of it was that he took a tour in the United States to talk about the book, and it was on that tour that he got to meet a number of academics who he ended up inviting to the first Mont Pelerin meeting, as well as a foundation, president of a foundation who helped to provide funds for people like Milton Friedman, Frank Knight, Fritz Machlup, and von Mises, who were all in the United States, to come over in 1947, which was not trivial at that time to be able to pay for people to make it across the Atlantic and come to a meeting in Europe.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're very much discussing your biography, the first volume of your biography of Hayek, rather than focusing on intellectual discussion of his legacy. But perhaps we can comment a bit on how relevant Hayek's economics and political philosophy contributions still are to explain the world today?
Sure. So I did mention a little earlier in our talk about the Mont Pelerin Society transcripts. And so if people are interested in seeing just how relevant some of the discussions were then now, I would urge them to have a look at that. They're actually a very interesting read too, because the people are discussing ideas and they're arguing about them. They're debating them. So it's a very useful one there. One of the things that Hayek took away from the Mont Pelerin Society meeting during his period at the University of Chicago, this is what I'm working on right now for Volume 2. He was at the University of Chicago from 1950 to 1962 on the Committee on Social Thought, and one of the things that he wrote and published while he was there is the Constitution of Liberty, which is his, in a sense, response to Keynes, saying, here is a book that looks at what liberal principles are and what sorts of society might follow from people taking these ideals. He talked about the political ideal of the rule of law as an important part of these liberal principles. This was a statement of how liberal principles might inform various policies. Now, he's Hayek, he's not Milton Friedman. He doesn't go into the nitty-gritty detail of policies, but he does talk about how certain principles should illuminate and kind of guide. He uses the metaphor of a gardener who cultivates as opposed to trying to control plants, but cultivates certain aspects of society that would allow people to thrive, each in their own individual ways. A third idea that comes out of Hayek, starting back in the 30s, but continuing on in his later years, is the dangers of scientism, the idea of scientific control of society, particularly when that is joined with the coercive power of government. And he saw that as quite dangerous. And I think we have a wonderful case study of that in the worldwide governmental responses to COVID. The idea was that science is supposed to give us the answer, and there should be a one-size-fits-all policy. That's really quite dangerous. I mean, one of the nice things about having in the United States a Florida or in Europe a Sweden is to say, look, we don't really know what the right policies are, and we certainly don't know what the costs of these shutdowns are going to be, but they seem to be quite enormous in terms of lost education for particularly poor students from low-income families. I mean, there was devastating effects that are still being felt and will continue to be felt from a policy that when anyone challenged it, well, no, this is what the science is, and we have government mandates that are going to be dictating things. So I think those are the ways in which what Hayek thought, worried about, wrote about, actually has resonance to various issues of very much great importance today.
Well, for those interested in learning much more about Hayek's intellectual biography, I would recommend them to read your book, your 2004 Hayek's Challenge, an intellectual biography of F.A. Hayek by the University of Chicago Press. But for a new generation of students interested in Hayek, which of his books would you recommend to attempt first?
Yeah, so I mean, I think The Road to Serfdom is always a safe place to start for people who generally want to learn more. But in terms of, and that's because it's a relatively short book, and it's for Hayek, it's very well written. You know, he was aiming it at a more popular audience. For students who might be students of economics, there are two articles that I would recommend rather than books. One is The Use of Knowledge in Society, where he talks about how a well-functioning market system will be able to coordinate human action in a world in which information is dispersed. Different people have different access to different information. It's really getting at in a theoretical economics kind of framework the sort of thing that Bastiat was getting at when he talked about Paris being fed. how millions and millions of people's activities are coordinated through a market system. Nobody says, I'm going to feed Paris. Yet so many people contribute to that particular outcome. And Hayek is talking about that in a general term. Another paper of his for people who have might be students in their first or second years in economics is The Meaning of Competition, where he talks about the actual competition that creates all sorts of new goods and services, the rivalry that creates that, and discovery of lower cost ways of producing goods, as opposed to the textbook perfect competition, which is also often quite misleading. The Austrians are sometimes caricatured as saying, but I think it's a great caricature, saying, well, yeah, they're the people who think there's no competition in perfect competition, there's no choice in consumer choice theory, because in consumer choice theory, it's equilibrium determines it. Everything is determined. And they're the people who want to actually get at the meanings of ideas like choice and competition. For people who are more politically, political science inclined, Individualism, True and False, I think, is a very nice piece. It was published in the 1940s, reflecting on the sort of political institutions that might be necessary in a liberal society, and also The Intellectuals and Socialism, which is a paper that he wrote in 1949 after the Mont Pelerin Society was formed, where he reflects on how what he calls intellectuals. He doesn't mean that just to be college professors or something like that. He means what he called the second-hand dealers in ideas, people who are well known for being public intellectuals, who have are happy to pontificate on all sorts of issues. And he says, and all of them seem to be kind of left wing, and they really have an influence. And what is a liberal to do? And it's his reflection on that, why that might be the case, and what a well-meaning liberal might do in response to it. And I think anyone who might be somewhat sympathetic to classical liberalism would find it to be a very enjoyable and inspirational read.
Well, excellent references. Good homework for everyone to do in the next few weeks. Thank you, Bruce, for joining us today. If you want to know more about Hayek's life, please read the first volume of his biography of Hayek with Hansjoerg Klausinger, published in 2022, Hayek Alive, 1899-1950. Thank you, Bruce, very much, and thank you all for listening.
Juan, thank you so much for having me on. It was a delight to have this discussion with you.
My pleasure. Thank you all very much for listening. This podcast is edited by the Vinson Center at the University of Buckingham. You can visit our website at vinsoncentre.com to access our podcast series and know more about the programs and events we host, both in Buckingham and in London. Please subscribe to our newsletter if you want to receive timely information on the Vinson Centre's agenda.